Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here for our discussion of this year's Washtenaw read, which is Being Human by Judith Heumann and Kristen Joyner. And I'm super excited to talk about the book with all of you. And we do have an upcoming event with Judith Heumann too, virtually, so you can tune in for that next month on Zoom. But today we're talking about her memoir. And I wanted to start kind of at the start of the book. She opens by saying, "I never wished I didn't have a disability." And as she grows up, it's kind of other people who make her feel ashamed or less than. It's not her. And I wanted to just kind of open by talking about her progression from confident as a child to guilty or ashamed, and then confident again, and what influenced her along the way, and just what you all kind of took out of her journey or thought about it or anything like that. That's kind of how I wanted to start.
I'll jump in, Elizabeth. One of the things that struck me about the book was her parents. And I haven't had a chance to talk about her parents in other discussions I've had. And I think they played a fundamental role in giving Judith Heumann the idea that she is just like any other kid and she should be able to do everything that she wants to do. And I feel like that very beginning for her with her family, and even her neighbors that she grew up with on her street, really just normalized everything for her. And I think it's as she got older and met people for the first time who didn't grow up with her and who were not part of her family, that she started to feel some distance with people.
Yeah, and I'll sort of pick up there too. It seems like then, she met this great group of people at Crip Camp, and or can't remember camp. What's the name of the camp?
Ned.
Thanks.
Camp Janned.
Camp Janned. Yes. So at Camp Janned, she met a bunch of like-minded folks, and then through the meeting of that group of folks, then she was able to sort of gain that confidence back, and that that fight for not only her rights, but she had these other people around her that she's like, but these people deserve to be heard too. And so getting that group together really, I think, put a big fire under her that brought all of that back. That was like, okay, just like her mom did when she was, fighting for Judy to be in the right place, in the right school, get the right education, that then she was able to take it up as an older teen and adult and be like, okay, no, this is where we're supposed to be. We need to be heard. We need to be listened to. And so I do think that that was modeled in the beginning, and then she lost it for a little bit and then picked it right back up. That was really cool to hear about.
Yeah, I think another influencing factor for her, or it just seems like it is in part her personality as well. Like when she is marginalized or told she can't do something or not given access, she gets angry, which is the appropriate response, I think. And I think that helped to push her to try and make a difference. And I just feel like her spirit and her kind of her sense of humor and just like her whole being is part of what gave her strength to do all the things that she did.
I thought it was really interesting too, how, at least the way it was told in the book, it seemed like she and her family didn't realize that she wouldn't be able to go to school. Like it was really the first, when her mom first took her to school, that it was really, she realized that first feeling of guilt and shame, because the principal said, oh no, like she can't go here. It's not accessible. Like we don't have a program for, kids in wheelchairs / kids with disabilities. And that's when she had to be kind of homeschooled for a bit with the tutor. And it was just so interesting to me that that was I guess both that like they didn't realize that, not that they should have, but that it was that there was the response was just like, oh no, like she can't go to school, you know, because it was that time in the nation and, you know, in the education system where there weren't programs in like public schools and things like that. And that was her first experience with being, well, just feeling kind of less than, I guess. That was like fascinating to me.
Yeah.
And I think it's also, oh, go ahead, Beth, I'm sorry.
Well, sorry, I was just thinking about how she spoke. She was so forlorn about not being able to go to school, and she, you know, it was all kind of coming to her like, wait a minute, you know, my younger sibling's going now. And so yeah, go ahead, Jacob.
And I might not be phrasing this correctly. What I wanted to say is something that first portion of the book kind of reminded me or taught me was that like we children, humans, but children specifically, don't know that they're meant to feel shame until somebody tells them to be ashamed. And that's like a kind of like a huge, that affected me in a huge way. And it really kind of colors how I'm going to move forward with my interactions with people with disabilities. But yeah, that just, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was,
Jacob. Go ahead,
what's
Beth.
that?
Go ahead.
Well, it just, when I was reading that, I read that, and then I read The Pretty One, and both, you know, they both could pinpoint exactly when they felt different, when they were marginalized and like, and they both, you know, remember exactly what happened and cried when they got home. And it made me really consider the idea that people don't need to be fixed, you know, that it's not about, and that's okay. And, you know, this, again, the same theme we discussed, but just like, wouldn't it be nice if we could all just be as we are without this level of, you know, the expectation of the perfect human being, you know?
I would be remiss if I didn't say the fact that her last name is Heumann just like blew my mind on so many levels with this. And I think, you know, to the point that several of you guys made, the fact that in her family, she was accepted equally, expected to participate equally, and caring for her wasn't a burden. It was just part of what the whole household needed to do, I think I think also the value to education. Like I'm always amazed by how little intention or realization we put towards it, but like the cultural expectation of like her parents, you know, were affected by the Holocaust.
Oh,
they survived a decade or two earlier. And I think that like, I think the fact that they expected her to participate in conversation and that sort of thing, it sort of made me think about how, as you're saying, Jacob, lots of people have that experience, like being a woman in a family and not really ever knowing that society expects you to be less than, kind of makes you a little bit more like, no, of course I'm going to speak up, versus being raised as, oh no, you should be quiet. That makes a very big difference.
I was also thinking about just childhood in general. I wondered if this was one of the reasons she felt so called to teach, was when she was talking about just playing with her other friends, how, I mean, kids notice differences, right? But there's not the shame attached to it, like Jacob said, but that they just were natural problem solvers and they just like figured out a way to play with her and include her in everything. And how that must have been so foundational to then compare that to her experiences of trying to go to school versus then when she was at camp, being with people who are also marginalized, just so how those different things interacted. But she carried this through her whole life, just that problem solving, like, why can't we just find a way though?
Yeah, and that thought it was interesting how she constantly pointed out in meetings, like we always waited until every person was available, every interpreter was ready, everyone had a chance to talk. And if you're not used to that, it's like, oh, this is taking longer. But if that's the culture, then it's like, yeah, of course we wait. And of course we're patient with everyone, and people who speak slowly get more time, and that's fine.
Yeah, I was really struck by that too. While they were, doing planning and all that stuff, in all different levels, making sure they included the folks that needed to be there, the attendants and the interpreters. Yeah, just really thoughtful.
I wanted to, well, I'll just say my next question. It's kind of related, but it's that I wrote down, due in large part to Judith's work, we have laws in place now that advocate for the rights of disabled people, and we have organizations like the AADL, but these weren't in place during her childhood and much of her younger adult life. And I guess I'm kind of interested in what surprised you most about that time. I mean, many of you might have been more educated than I was about the lack of resources and the lack of basically just, accessibility for disabled folks. But I was really surprised by some of the things, like inmates. I knew there wasn't probably motorized wheelchairs in the 50s and 60s, but, other things I was super surprised about, like when she did end up going to school, all of the kids who had disability, whether it was a physical or mental, were just put together and kind of taught the same. That was very surprising to me. So I was interested in what surprised you and what you kind of thought were some of the biggest changes that we see now today.
One of the things that surprised me a lot was the frequency of the toileting issues, and that was for her. And of course it would be, but it's not something we think about. But we had, I had the chance to sit in on another talk with her recently when she was with the U of M, and she brought that up as well, and that she never thought she'd see the day that incontinence pads would be advertised on television, as they are, because she's needed those for far longer, and now it's part of the mainstream. People, you see them dancing on the screen when in their depends. But it was so much a factor, and like how much she had to, she'd have to wait to pee after an interview, just everything. It was like centered around when she was going to be able to go to the bathroom. That surprised me.
It's amazing to think about what you just said, Beth, and then think about Judith and this group of people going and sitting in this building for, like, was it 40 days, 50 days that they were there, with a lack of a lot of provisions, and still, persevering and doing it and helping each other out. And it just strikes me when you're talking about that particular issue, that then to be in a situation where you're not even in your own home environment, for this really long extended period of time, speaks to the strength of her and all the other people who were involved.
Right. I mean, just thinking again about the Black Panthers, bringing them food, and just how folks reached out and really helped them to keep it going. It was really, really powerful.
This is going to seem like a strange analogy, but like in some ways I think of it like if I was trying to cook for people 10 years ago and someone was vegan, it was a pain. And now it's like, that's how I cook most of the time. And it's a base that everybody can do. And I think it's almost the same kind of thing, like accommodating someone who had a physical disability was like, oh, how are we going to do this? And designing the community in a way that is accessible. It's like, oh, obviously this is how everybody gets around. Ramps are great for people with strollers, like those kinds of things of just not thinking about the fact that how you design lifts everyone. It's not just accommodating that one wheelchair. I think it's just a very different way of thinking now than it was prior to ADA.
Well, and also the whole concept that, you know, Judith talks about this in a lot of the different talks that I've seen her do, but that, you know, those of us who are right now, what she calls non-disabled, that can change and will change for most of us statistically, that we will likely have either a temporary or permanent disability in our lifetime. And those changes that we're making for people who currently have physical disabilities, those are for us. Those are for the, you know, the people who are physically able to build those ramps right now. They're going to need those ramps in however many years. And so that's something to really, like, I don't know, I am always thinking about that, and it's just constantly sort of blowing my mind, is that, like, you know, this thing that you're seeing these people use, that's amazing, this assistive technology and everything, like, you understand this is for you too, right?
Katie, I was thinking about that too, because I follow up for a number of disabled people on Twitter and followed disability Twitter, and someone had tweeted fairly recently that glasses are a disability aid, and most people don't generally think of them as a disability aid, but think about what's possible if we normalized disability aids. And like, I've been thinking about that every time I wear my glasses or I see people with glasses. Like, it's such a small thing that is so normalized that we don't really think of it as a disability aid, but it is. And then how many other things like could be that simple? I mean, it's still not simple necessarily, like access to healthcare and costs of glasses, all of that. But still, it's normalized in a way that like wheelchairs aren't as much, or other like walking aids or hearing, different things like that.
And that makes me think about how something that surprised me when I was reading this book is how little I knew about the history of disability rights and the fight that led to Section 504 and so on and so forth. It made me think about my time being a teacher and how the classroom is a place where public schools are living proof of ADA. And we don't even teach that in our schools. And I think about how valuable that would be for students of varying disabilities to have that education and understanding as they're in school.
And abilities like that. I
yes.
think the point that she brought up that was so true. She said, if you didn't see them because people in wheelchairs couldn't get on the bus, you didn't know that they would use the bus. If you can't see them in your school, you don't know that they go to school. You know, it was this, like, the invisibility factor was really fascinating, and how people are talking more about invisible disabilities, like the fact that you have to talk about it to get an accommodation as opposed to there being sort of a universal accommodation is interesting.
Yeah, I was pretty shocked myself. I don't recall learning about the ADA or 504 or anything like that in elementary school. It's possible that it was mentioned very briefly, but it certainly wasn't covered in any large way that I would remember. And I thought that was so interesting because one of the big parts of the book is her suing the New York Board of Education to become a teacher, you know, and there's a whole traumatizing part where she has to go through the doctor's examinations, and they decide she's not fit to teach, and that's why she sues and is able to eventually teach. But it just made me think too, like, wow, she was a teacher, and we still don't spend a lot of time thinking about this all the important work she and her colleagues did over the past 50 years,
Yeah, I thought about that too, especially because so much of the work is built on the civil rights movement and all of the work that went in that. And we spent so much time in school talking about the civil rights movement and then nothing about any disability history, activism, anything. Like, I don't recall ever really talking about it. Even like really, like, FDR was the only person with disabilities I ever remember being talked about like at all in school.
Well, Helen Keller. You know, back when ADA passed, I was working at Goodwill Industries in Grand Rapids. So I was working with people with disabilities and, you know, helping them to get jobs and stuff. So it was, I remember when it got passed and like all of us being really thankful, you know, as staff, like how significant it was. So that was pretty cool.
I was in school at the time, and I remember they put an elevator in the school, and it was like, of course we need an elevator, you know, but they never had one before, and then they had to. And I remember they built an auditorium, and one of the sides had a ramp to get up onto it, and it was built into the design of it. And thinking, had that auditorium been built 4 years earlier, it just wouldn't have been a factor. So how do you get those timpani drums on there? How do you get the bass drum on there? Like all these other things that are educational benefit from accessibility.
Well, and it's interesting too, because the whole, you know, sit-in, this was brought up earlier, where they stayed in the building for like 40 some days. That would be fascinating to teach to children. I mean, kids, I feel like would be like, wow. I mean, kids love that kind of stuff, you know, like, I can't believe they like stayed there and didn't have, you know, blah, blah, blah. So it's just even more interesting to me that that has been glossed over in a lot of textbooks. Maybe not anymore, but you know, I don't know, when I was growing up, certainly.
Especially since it showed like the fact that the Black Panthers brought food is like, that is a major part of what the Black Panthers were, and yet that's not the part that's taught. You know, the fact that they did like lots of things for school lunches and that kind of thing, it's like we don't hear that part. And it's like, that's a great way to enter for kids, to tell them about all these different groups that work together. It's a lost opportunity, but I'm hoping that with her book and with you know, just more visibility in terms of internet visibility, like that it becomes more normalized.
I think a kid's book about that incident, you know, that situation would be really cool. A children's book that she could write, maybe.
And it reminds me of towards the end of the book, it might have been the last sentence, she says something that's like we need to wake up and realize that we are the people who shape the country. It's not the government that shapes the country. We shape the government. You know what I'm saying? And it's like, sometimes I feel like, I don't, I swear to God, I'm not a crazy militant hippie. But if I was, I would say that the government and really the status quo doesn't want us to know that if we all work together, if we all come together, that we can make huge change. And what you guys have been saying, it reminded me of that last part of the book where she's like, we are the ones who get to do the, we make the rules. And it was a really nice reminder of that. Yeah, if we all come together, we can make huge change.
I think it's difficult because you have to be willing to break the rules. You know, she was examined by doctors and found unfit to be a teacher. Well, if she was just a rule follower, she would have just said, well, oh, well, too bad for me. You know, the sit-in in San Francisco was all about breaking the rules. You know, it was nonviolent, but it's breaking the rules. And sometimes I feel like the only progress that can be made is by breaking rules. Because if you follow the rules, nobody's ever going to give you anything that you deserve. And it's kind of a strange lesson, I guess. Anyway, that's my take on it. But Jacob, I agree with your point, absolutely. That if you could come together like all of these civil liberty groups and the Black Panthers and the disability movement and all these other groups, oh man, just think.
what you're saying about rules, Christopher, makes me think about the fact that like a lot of times the rules come from the same people who have created the system that only works for those people. And so it's like, why not break the rules? Because they're not your rules, you know, they don't serve you, they don't help you. I think one place where the disability community faces difficulty, though, even if they all come together, is the government's always going to come back and say, well, that costs money, we don't have that money. And, you know, where other parts of the civil rights movement, they could make progress without it being a huge monetary cost. So it's disappointing because there is that money, it's just not applied to the right places.
But that could have stopped, that was almost going to be a stopper at all, you know, that it would even pass ADA and 504, because it would be too expensive. It will always be too expensive. But we all need that stuff, you know, the same, like the ramps and the so many accommodations that we all have now that we can use.
And I'll pay the tax money so people can get on the bus. Like I'll take my money and you know, make things accessible. I'm fine with that. I'm actually would prefer it.
I won't, and here's why. Because we pay a lot of taxes, but where is it going? The military, which I think is also an important part of the book, is the connection to the anti-war movement in Vietnam, of recognizing like we're sending men to go to war who are coming home disabled and then have no place in society, that we refuse to accommodate them. And so I think it was really the connection between disability advocates and veterans returning home who, I mean, she also made the point that like they were also respected as men, as veterans who were coming home. They were given a lot more voice than she was as a woman who was not born with it, but acquired it fairly young.
Yeah, the fact that when Bob Dole recently passed away and they kept talking about how he was such an advocate for ADA and, you know, the anniversaries of ADA, and I'm just like, how am I not hearing this woman's name associated with all these things? And, you know, he was respected as a veteran and a person in government.
This kind of ties into another thing that she touches on in the book, which is kind of the differences between how the US and other countries, I don't want to say dealt with, but I guess how the experiences of disabled people in the US versus other countries. And so like I think like her note was, in the US, like you have to be willing to advocate for change. Whereas in other countries, there's already universal health care, but oftentimes disabled people are kind of, depending on the country, just put set aside as like kind of like pariahs almost, if that's the right word. And found that was really interesting. She said it was particularly stark to her throughout the 80s as she was doing work in that decade. But she says, like, here in the US, even once laws were passed, she and her colleagues had to actually advocate for them to be implemented. Like, they didn't just pass the law and then it was like, okay, her colleagues and she had to be like, okay, but now you have to put the ramp in, it's the law. Now you have to put an elevator in. Whereas often in other countries, disabled folks got better care originally, but maybe weren't, were seen as slightly more, not that they weren't necessarily seen as tragic here, but were seen as more tragic. I just thought that was interesting, her drawing that comparison between the US and other countries, and wondered if anyone had thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how she makes the point that like other countries do have this universal health care, but they are looking at disabilities as a health issue. Whereas she is looking at it as a rights issue. It's not something to be cured. And so while they might get what they needed health-wise sooner, it's the rights that you have to advocate for. And I just had never thought about the civil rights versus the health aspect of it. I thought that was really interesting.
Right, they're getting the care that they need, but not really getting the like respect and like advocacy that they need in other countries, I guess. Was right, Lucy? That's kind of what you said.
Well, yeah, and also the idea that like you don't need to be cured. I mean, she talks about that in the Pretty One too. It's not that people with disabilities need to be cured. It's that our society and where we live and our culture needs to be made accessible for everybody. And so that's part of that too.
We touched on this earlier too, but Judith talks a lot about anger and being angry fueling her at times, but being angry is also seen as conventionally unladylike, especially in the earlier decades where she was growing up. And, you know, Christopher, when you mentioned breaking the rules being really important, I guess I'm interested in what role you all think anger plays in change, both in the context of the book and in other instances that we might see today.
Well, what is that saying where it's like, if you're not angry, you're not paying attention? And I think anger is like all emotions has many facets. Something that anger does, or something that anger can do, is motivate. So I think that that's an important role that anger plays when it comes to political work like this.
Yeah, I was going to say the common response to anger is fight. And so, you know, if you get mad, you tend to want to fight something. And so that is something that can be really powerful about that, is like, okay, I'm mad and now I will fight you. And I'm going to fight this thing until it changes, until it's right. And so I think that that is a big motivator for anybody really who wants to become an advocate and an activist, and just really like, that's a big way to get motivated to step forward, is to get angry about something.
I think it was anger that brought so many people to the streets in 2020, with, you know, just finally people recognizing the stuff that we had been going on for a long time, but that was frequently being filmed. I think anger really does have a place in moving things along. And Judith mentioned when we saw the clip that Shoshana shared with us from her on the Daily Show, and she talked about, you know, the anger fueled a lot of what she did, but also that I think she mentioned there that, you know, a lot of times we tend to get upset when we're angry, and we might cry when we're angry, and that might even make us angrier and want to work harder. But don't be fooled by tears.
Well, and I think too, it takes a courageous and special person to not get so angry that you like can't be productive in instigating change, you know, because I think a lot of the times you can just be so frustrated and so angry that you might just turn to giving up. You're just like, I can't deal with this, you know? And I think it's amazing that Judith was able to channel her anger into like concrete actions that moved her goals forward. You know, I think that's very, very difficult when you know, you are angry at so many things that you're being confronted with.
Yeah, I really admired her stubbornness to not give in and keep going and going. And, you know, she doesn't exactly strike me as an angry person. So much of the book, I think, is full of her joy of just living and her joy in sharing life with I mean, she mentioned so many times how many wonderful, inspiring people she has met. And so I think it is an interesting thing to think about how she used her anger and her emotions to channel her energies and move forward without feeling deteriorated from the negative aspect of that.
It does seem like she kind of always kept her sense of humor as well, right? So that's something that I really liked about her, is that you can tell she's funny, right? She's funny. She can be self-depreciating. She's just so that really helped in the book too, to just sort of like levitate it a little bit.
Mhm.
I was so interested, and it was almost difficult for me to follow at times how many amazing different jobs she had and how many times she moved back and forth across the country. I was like, wow, that is amazing. I mean, she was in California and then in DC and worked in the, Department of Education and everything. I thought that was incredible, and just it's really amazing to think about how many different organizations and how many different aspects of the federal government she ended up being involved in over the course of her work in the past 50 years.
Yeah, every time she would move, I'd just be like, dang, I can't even imagine it. I've done it once far and then came back, and I can't imagine doing it multiple times.
Well, and it was particularly difficult because, like, in California, they had aides in place and everything, and she was much more able to be more mobile and stuff. And then she would move to the East Coast where there wasn't that, and it would be so difficult to find an apartment and find assistance. And I just thought that was incredibly amazing that she was continued to be willing to do that, because I think I personally, I don't even want to move across the country right now, and I don't need aid at this point in my life. I was just like, wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, it's made me be thinking about teleworking, because I think that one thing the pandemic has brought to light is that you can work from home. There are a lot of jobs that we thought before you didn't have to, or you couldn't do, and now you can. And that does make it a lot easier for people to work in different places where mobility issues are a problem. But I also worry that it's like, oh, well, this building's really cumbersome, just work from home. And then you won't. And I think I'm really glad she brought that up in the book about the importance of running into someone in the elevator and having a translator right there so you can talk to them at that moment. And I think that technology is great, but we can't exclude people from spaces just because the technology allows them to participate from further away.
Yeah, it's almost like the technology could be helpful, but it also could be hiding. It's like they have to hide behind this crutch, and then it's not making the issue any more visible than it needs to be. It's just creating more invisibility around it.
Well, I think we even run into that when we work from home. There's so many times that I want to catch someone at work to just have a 5-minute conversation, and then you don't catch each other, and then you have to compose a complicated email or send a Zoom meeting for a 10-minute talk. And there is a lot of benefit to being in the same space and being able to have those conversations. And of course, if a translator is needed, then it's super important that one's there and available. So Judith concludes the book by kind of her answers to the question, how do we move forward now? And I just wanted to discuss how she answers that, and get your thoughts on if you have some similar or different answers, and just on what she says in the sense of looking to the future.
I don't have the book in front of me, so I don't remember exactly how it ended. But mainly it seemed like she was talking about how things have been created for everybody, that even though that they were created initially for people that needed adaptations, but how they benefited folks. I don't know if that was part of that chapter.
There's something that she says in the end. I have the quote right here, because I think especially like it could be applicable to so many things, especially in like the time that we're living in now. But she says, how we treat disabled people, how we treat minorities boils down to our fundamental beliefs about humanity. Do we believe that we all have something to contribute? And I think that can be applied to her story here, but universally, if you could keep that in your mind, might be a way to start making change.
I also think the idea that, one of the things I remember when she talks about being in the education department and them saying like, well, let's just get it set up for like normal kids first, and then we'll deal with the disability. And she's like, there are many issues with that sentence. But I think that the idea also of like, take action, be slightly wrong and fix it, and be slightly wrong and fix it, and accept that things keep moving. And I was at the Henry Ford Museum recently, and there was a sign that said adult changing tables in this room. And I'm like, never thought of that as an issue, never thought of that as a need. And now I do, and so like taking that information and being flexible enough to change, when someone says, well, why haven't we made sure that someone with a disability is nominated for this? Because we haven't yet, and now we need to, and I think that's a good thought of not just let's freeze until we get everything perfect. It's let's act and then keep acting.
Yeah, I definitely see that sentiment and see that things will happen. I don't know if anybody else felt that it was kind of spooky at this point in the world to read a memoir by someone who acquired her disability because of polio, which for most people, you got polio and you like got a fever and maybe you threw up and you felt a little nauseous, or it could paralyze you. You could get COVID and get the sniffles, or you could have permanent nerve damage and organ damage. And so given our current situation, like things will have to happen when we figure out what is the outcome of long COVID and other things, and what our needs will be as a society and as community, and how we can move forward together and not leave that and not ignore it, especially when the CDC kind of said like, hey, don't worry, everyone who's going to die just has a disability, so don't worry. Like, that's the narrative. And so we have a lot of work to do, especially right now, which, yeah, this book was kind of spooky thinking about it in those terms.
I had not thought about it in those terms, and I'm like, whoa, yeah, wow. Whew.
Sorry to be a downer.
No, you were an enlightener. Neither up nor down.
Flatline. I'm just thinking back to when she had her the meetings with the doctors. I was so pissed about that, but also just like I just felt so bad for her being such a young woman. She had no idea how to navigate this situation, and to be put in that position, it just was, it was wrong. I'm glad she sued them.
Yeah, I would argue she navigated it perfectly, and they said, no, you can't bring this person in. And they had all the power in the situation, because if she said, I refuse to do the exam, and they're like, well, okay, then you don't get your teaching license. So
Yeah, that's
yeah,
right.
being in a place where you're doing everything right and the system has the power is the incredibly frustrating point.
Yeah.
Well, any other conclusions or final thoughts? I have gone through all my questions, and if anyone has anything else, I would love to hear it, but no pressure.
I loved reading about her and her husband. I just, that's what I would like to say. It brought a smile to my heart.
It was
Yeah.
amazing how they didn't speak the same language when they met. That was so cool.
Yeah, that was cool.
My just final thought is that I'm just glad that this is the Washtenaw Reads pick. This isn't a book that I maybe would have picked up on my own, but I really enjoyed it and learned a lot, and I'm so grateful to have read it.
Yeah, it was.
I totally agree with that. Yeah.
It was a great pick. It wasn't the one yeah, I'm just really, I like it a lot. I'm very glad. And we obviously had a lot to say about it.
I think something that will stick with me too. Oh, sorry.
Nope, go.
Will stick with me that we've touched on, but like just her use of the term non-disabled, and how important it is to like keep that in your mind, because it just means that just because you don't have a disability right now, the likelihood that at some point you will, temporarily or permanently, I mean, just aging in and of itself causes deterioration, and we want to age, so that puts us in a bracket to no longer be non-disabled. But even just having that word in my brain, I'm glad that she gave me that language.
I just wanted to give shout out to the Washtenaw Library for Blind and Physically or Print Disabled and outreach, just because there's constantly that, like, what can we do to adapt, and how can the library make that more accessible? And I think that having community resources think that way, it's really nice to be part of an organization that thinks that way, and also in like fun ways, like how can we make games accessible? It's not just how can you print your tax forms. So good job.
Well, thanks everyone for joining today. And I wanted to direct anyone listening to the WashtenaWreads.org site. Has some read-alikes for both kids, teens, and then also adults. It has some other events listed, both from the AADL and from other participating libraries, and a variety of other things related to being human and to Judith Heumann and her work. So if you're interested, I would recommend checking that out. And thanks everyone for the great discussion today, and for reading the book, and for all of your amazing thoughts.
Thank you.
All right.